Hello and welcome to Dateline London. In today's programme, the attempted coup in Turkey, the horrors in France and the enormous political changes in the United Kingdom. My guests today are Guney Yildiz, who's a Turkish journalist, Bénédicte Paviot of France 24, Suzanne Lynch of the Irish Times and Steve Richards of The Independent. Very good to see you. Well, Turkey first, and let's begin just with what we know. I mean, first of all, do you think the people of Turkey were really shocked and surprised by a coup when they thought the army was out of politics?
Exactly. This is a big shock to many, including close observers of Turkish politics. But I was speaking to a senior AK Party member yesterday throughout the night in the heat of the incident.
That's the governing party.
Governing party, yes. And he was telling me that they were expecting that they knew that some people in the military are plotting for a coup, but they didn't expect that they will be so well organized. So in the heat of the debate, heat of the incident, they weren't sure how it will turn out. And President Erdogan put the blame squarely on Gülen movement, which is a US-based a movement led by US-based Turkish Islamist cleric who used to have a lot of followers in Turkish security. But I spoke to their spokespersons too. They initially wanted to distance themselves, but when I asked, do you want to condemn? Would you condemn this coup? They kind of didn't want to do that. But this is apparently an unsuccessful coup organized by mid to senior level soldiers based in gendarmerie, Air Force, Naval Force and First Army Division. So it's not like a bunch of, small group of soldiers acting on this. And it looked like it was very well planned on a military level, because the coup plotters initially very quickly took on strongholds of Erdogan loyalists, like Turkish intelligence, which is very much loyal to Erdogan and very powerful. Also the Turkish Chief of General Staff, high command of the Turkish army is very loyal to Erdogan, and also special police forces, which has become grown under Erdogan and become kind of a rival to the army. But on an administrative level, it didn't sound like it was well organized. The coup plotters didn't have any access to the media, mainstream media. The statement they read out on the state TV channel wasn't clear. What their motivation is, where they stand wasn't clear, and it allowed government to get ahead of the curve very quickly in a few hours.
And there have been coups in the past, in the last 50 years or so. I was thinking of the Evren coup in the 1980s, which was, I talked to many Turkish people about it. They welcomed it at the time because they thought it was bringing stability, or that the military could bring stability. This is a completely different political situation, isn't it?
This is completely different. And in Evren's time, Turkey had 4 different coups in the past. 3 of them like bloody coups, and the last one in 1997 was a soft coup. But in all these cases, it was a military which didn't have any rivals like intelligence or police force. Was acting against a weak civilian government in a turbulent situation, which in turn people welcomed it. This time we have a strong government who has control over a significant part of the security establishment. So it's not like just one coup, it's like almost a triple coup. A coup against the high echelons of the army, police and the strong civilian government.
I'll just quickly go around everybody else in this. Suzanne, I mean, this is a country that has aspirations to join Europe. It's changed, for instance, people can't be executed in Turkey in order to do so, and it is right on the borders of Europe. So this sounds a big shock, doesn't it?
Yes, the whole geopolitical context of this is hugely significant. It's often a cliche that Turkey bridges east and west, but this is very much the case. It's obviously a member of NATO, and this has huge ramifications in terms of what happens now in connection with Turkey and Greece. It's a US ally, although that relationship has become under pressure. But most importantly for Europe, the timing of this is very interesting. Over the last few months, we've seen an unprecedented engagement by the EU with Turkey due to the migrant crisis. Many people at the time criticised the EU for a cynical, pragmatic move, offering Turkey promises of further visa-free access to the European Union in exchange for help with the migrant crisis, led by Merkel, of course, who was driving this policy. Now, what's happened is that Merkel's gamble has paid off. The number of migrants coming through Turkey to Greece has fallen. But now, ironically, what may happen now is as the reaction from Erdogan plays out in the next few weeks, we may see a hardening of response from Turkey, maybe a clampdown on dissent, a clampdown on political dialogue, and that will, if you like, give the European Union a pretext for not giving visa-free travel to Europe, because a lot of countries are against that realistically.
Stephen, that's part of the point. I mean, Turkey is a democracy in the sense that it has elections, but it's not pluralist in the sense that minority views are always taken into account in the way that the European Union would like.
Yeah, but thank goodness for the European Union, in the sense that at least there is some leverage there, given that Turkey wants to join. And I think that's an important part of the dynamic, even though we're talking sort of decades away, apparently. And that will be an important lever. And the UK, out of the European Union, will have no power. It's a really interesting example, actually, of what happens when or if you leave the European Union, because they will be key players in trying to create a more stable Turkey. From what you were saying earlier, even though the coup seems to have been put down quite quickly by the government, it's bound to generate even greater instability in Turkey, an already unstable situation.
And that is the last. We're coming on to France in just a second, Benedict, but you know, bomb attacks in Ankara airport, bomb attacks effectively also against the threat of the economic disruption caused by terrorism, and now this. We don't want unstable Turkey for any part of the world, for the Middle East, for Asia, for Europe.
We don't, and that's why it will be very interesting to see how President Erdogan, what he does next. Is he going to become more authoritarian? Is he going to clamp down, as you were saying, on dissent? I think that the temptation or the decision will probably be one that will be very quickly made. What is slightly strange to me is the fact that there were these rumours, apparently not known by us, but he, President Erdogan, was fearing this, and his worst fears have come true. So it's quite interesting that he had to be on FaceTime. You know, if the internet, we see, normally if you're on FaceTime, that's the kiss of death. You can't even get to a studio. And of course, having broadcast for the BBC to Africa for years, the first thing you do, you know, you go to those studios, you blow up the transmitters after you've done...
That's how you organise a coup. That's
how you organise a coup. You take over. So it's very interesting. And there were 2 planes, I believe, shot down. Helicopters. As we go on air, there are 8 putschists, we think, claiming asylum in Greece. How Greece handles that will be very important as well. But what Steve and both Suzanne were saying about the EU is absolutely key. And yes, the fact that the United Kingdom is going to be negotiating its divorce from there lessens its voice in that possible solution.
Well, let's move on, because in France, after the Euro 2016 football passed off successfully and without any serious incidents, there was considerable relief in the prospect of some kind of relaxation of the state of emergency. That lasted until Bastille Day and the use of a lorry as a terror weapon. Where is France and Europe and the rest of us in dealing with those from Nice to Orlando who have murder on their minds and claim some kind of political motive? I mean, the reason I introduced Orlando there is, from what we know of the perpetrator, he was a bit of a loser in society, on the margins, and is now being claimed by Islamic State as if he was some kind of hero to do the kind of ghastly thing that he did.
This is what intelligence services around the world, not just in France or in the UK, this is a growing phenomenon, and one that is impossible in an open democracy to prevent. No matter how much money, no much solutions or investigations, reports that you do, and there is a report in France that came out not very long ago that was recommending that France actually do what the United States did when they realized the FBI wasn't talking enough to the CIA after the 9/11, that there had been warning signals and that they didn't take up on them. So that France needs to actually be collaborating and pooling its information. There's too much competition between the various parts of the intelligence services. Having said that, France, Britain, America, the Israelis are amongst the best intelligence services. But you can't put in an open democracy, nor would you want to put, for reasons of civil liberties, and that's the whole balance that we need to strike. This was a soft target. Effectively, the seafront of Nice was turned into a crime scene, a 2-kilometre crime scene, 84 dead as we speak, 200 injured, amongst them children. It's horrific, and our societies, unlike the 13th of November attacks, Those needed logistics. Those needed real planning outside and inside France, whether it was from Belgium, wherever it was from. What is not needed with a man who's got a lorry that he rented 2-3 days before, who allegedly, according to French colleagues of mine, are telling me he was a womanizer, openly ate pork, was not a practicing Muslim. He is going to be reclaimed by, as we've just witnessed, as IS or Islamic State. It's inspired by them, but what do you do against that?
It's all too familiar. I mean, the Orlando attack, a guy, again, similarly in margins of society, the Brussels perpetrators as well. You know, we've seen a lot of this, and that makes it even more difficult for the intelligence services.
I think what's particularly worrying about this development is that as ISIS is losing ground in the Middle East, it may increase its targets in the West. And really, I think it's even more worrying that this person seems to have had no direct links with organised terrorism, because it's showing the influence that Islamic State, particularly over social media, is having on the debate, on the disenfranchised, who maybe don't have formal links with Islamic State, but are using that as a kind of a justification or an ideology that they can cling to and justify their own acts. Now, what is different about this attack from the November attacks in Paris and the March attacks in Brussels is that it's not part of this European-wide network. Really a Belgian-French, very sophisticated terrorist network was behind those two attacks, and then questions were asked about how can terrorists and how can arms move freely between countries across the European Union. Now, this debate will no doubt come up again, but in terms of this specific incident, it seems that it's more of an isolated incident, and that will give at least EU policymakers some kind of a breathing space in terms of this event.
And Steve, you know, the thought that everybody in Britain has about this is it could happen here, or it could happen in Germany, it could happen anywhere.
Yeah, and of course, you know, it has happened here on a smaller scale. Yeah, and I'm always asking quite senior officials, like at the Home Office, you know, well, how come it's always at the moment France and not here? And of course, there is one issue which is, touch wood, of some benefit to the UK, which is it's much harder to get the weapons over here. And as you were saying, they kind of are freely travelling around the rest of the EU, and that's something that has to be addressed, I think. But what cannot be addressed, as you were saying, is some individual loner doing this and then IS claiming, in effect, credit.
Which is the Orlando parallel.
Which is the Orlando parallel.
Well, you're going to come in, Suzanne.
But on that issue about Britain, I mean, it is interesting again in the debate about Britain now having decided to leave the European Union. Theresa May herself is on record back in April saying that she believes that British security would be better served by staying in the European Union. She listed a number of things: the European arrest warrant, the passenger name records, Europol. Because ironically, Britain was already not in Schengen, and it already had opt-out of the bits it didn't want. It actually had a very, very good arrangement. So it'll be interesting to see how the new Prime Minister comes out and responds to this, when there is going to be inevitable claims that this may show lack security in Europe. In fact, the very opposite is the case when it comes to Britain.
Guney, basically, if it hadn't been for the coup, I would be asking you about Turkey's experience on terrorism too, because that is also a destabilising factor in Turkish society. I mean, if in Ankara, in Istanbul, in Izmir, and other places, isn't it? And
interestingly, what unifies France and Turkey is both countries were very vocal against the Assad regime. You know, Turkish and French policies with regard to intervention in Syria were quite similar. France was never like a supporter of Assad regime. They were right from the beginning very vocal against the Assad regime, and it's ironic that they were targeted by ISIS more than any other countries. Another reason I can think of is probably France has more Arab Muslim population than any other European countries, and because of the colonial legacy, both in Syria and also in northern Africa, you have a easily radicalized, could be radicalized Arab Muslim population, which and ISIS thinks they can create an anti-Islamic backlash in French society.
That's what they're trying to do.
Easier than other countries.
That is a worry, isn't it? The far right in France, the politics of it aside, there's also some rumblings that people fear that far right groups will take some kind of vague retaliation against people they don't like.
Yes, I think that there might be individual acts, but the point is, the elephant in the room is the French presidential elections next May. And certainly we already know, and we have known for over 18 months, if the polls are correct, and in France they generally are dangerously accurate, that Marine Le Pen will get through to the second round of the presidential election. Unlike her father, not as a surprise, but we know it's coming down the track. So what we're already witnessing, unlike the aftermath and the fallout from the 13th of November Paris attacks, is the fact that there is not a political unity. We've got this. It was supposed to end on the 26th of July. Only the afternoon on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, the French president, in his traditional address or interview to the nation, said it's going to stop. We can't continue all the time. It's already been renewed 3 times. And the reason it was renewed up to now is the 1-month Euro 2016, which passed off successfully, and no terror attack. And then a few hours later, the Nice attack. So the problem now is there is a law that is helping to give the government tools to be able to carry out raids quite easily, to clamp down, to dismantle jihadist groups. But the problem is the civil liberties and how the politicization also, I think very much that has begun to happen from the opposition, starting to really make some murmurings about what needs to be done and criticising the French government and the French authorities. So this is quite different to the aftermath of the 13th of November. And I think the presidential election coming up is really, Europe is going to be at the heart of it. Marine Le Pen has said that. And yes, she will be appealing and she will have a lot of resonance with a growing number of people who feel insecure. President Hollande has made it very clear France is at war with the so-called Islamic State, at war with terrorism, and it's here to stay. It's part of everyday life now. It's a reality.
Well, let's move on, because Britain has a new Prime Minister and a reshaped government with, for the first time, a Minister for Brexit. Plus, we also have Boris Johnson as our new Foreign Secretary, adding to the gaiety of nations in various ways. What do we make of the shape of the new British government and of British politics? I mean, what do you make of the way that Theresa May, we should remind people, has got a majority of 12 in the House of Commons, which is very, very slim?
It is very slim, and that is the context of everything. Brexit will dominate the life of this new government, and it is a new government. We haven't had a general election last week. We've got a new government. I mean, it was a brutal cabinet reshuffle, which she had clearly planned for some time, because she carried it out with great ruthlessness and speedily. But you're right, she will have to navigate the nightmarish paths towards Brexit in all its complexity, with a tiny majority being watched on hourly basis by some of the Eurosceptic MPs who are currently euphoric about the way she's reshuffled her cabinet and made clear that Brexit is Brexit. But any sign of distancing from that will cause mayhem. And it's a really difficult position. I mean, she will have a honeymoon to die for over the summer. She hasn't got any effective political opposition at the moment, because Labour are having another leadership contest. But the wider context of deciding what form Brexit takes, getting it through the European Union, when to trigger Article 50 when the whole process begins, is, I think, going to be fraught with difficulty. And the way she's structured her government, so there are in effect at least 4 cabinet ministers heavily involved in this. David Davis in charge of Brexit, Liam Fox in charge of negotiating trade, the Treasury inevitably in the form of the Chancellor, and Theresa May herself, who will take the lead. Now, managing those individuals, all with different views so far. I haven't mentioned Boris Johnson. The Foreign Office is another one.
And Andrea Leadsom doing environment and farming, which is very important.
Which is very important. And all with slightly different views as to what Brexit should take. I think it's going to make John Major and the Maastricht Treaty in the mid-90s look like a tea party.
What's your take on this, Suzanne?
Well, it was quite interesting this week watching the unfolding drama in Westminster, in Brussels, where I'm based, and really, while the mood seemed to be kind of quite a bit of fun and final Prime Minister's questions for Cameron, actually in Brussels the mood was one of sober realism, really. That this is really no laughing matter, that the appointment of Theresa May has made Brexit absolutely a reality now. She said that, she's been very clear. So I think a lot of people in the country were quite bemused by the whole tone, I think, of things, and the sense that perhaps these appointments, as you laid out, were motivated by domestic political and party political concerns rather than what's best for the country as it embarks on what is absolutely the most challenging act of diplomacy for the last 50 years. So by appointing Boris Johnson, obviously a divisive figure, that's fine. People do respect him to some extent, but really, what is the wisdom of putting somebody in who has already insulted a number of world leaders when you were trying to get the best deal for Britain with the European Union?
Well, that's an interesting calculation. There is better having him in the tent than out the tent, and you know how to finish that sentence. But I mean, what do you make of that? He was booed at the French embassy this week before, obviously, the
French ambassador's residence on the 14th of July,
exactly.
Bastille Day. Yes, I witnessed it. We think it was actually Brits who were doing it, not the French. And I would say it was roughly about 15% of the guests there.
But what, do you think it is a problem, particularly in the short term? Perhaps in a few months' time you can see the strategy. You know, he's an intelligent man. He will be very sober in the office, and people will look at his past comments in a different light.
Well, from the domestic political side, for a moment, it is a huge opportunity for Boris. Boris, who is going to be a candidate for the top job of Tory leader, Boris, who is going to be Prime Minister, and that fell completely by the wayside. And this seems to be a natural phenomenon in British politics. When you're the favourite, you don't get it. Had he got through to the duel, which he didn't get, as he's the Tory darling, we'd be in a different situation. But the fact is, he's going to be criticised everywhere he goes, here and also abroad. He will have to tackle this all the time. So he's going to have to. He's very intelligent. He masters his brief, but he's going to. I think Theresa's going to want to really make sure that she tries to control his message.
Guney, I just wondered how, you know, he wrote a pretty juvenile poem which won a prize, which said things about President Erdogan, which I think, on reflection, you might think are rather silly. I mean, does that matter to people in Turkey?
I mean, the Turkish President's office was asked about this, actually. What do they make of the appointment of Boris Johnson? They replied, our relationship with the UK goes beyond personalities. And he also used his first ever opportunity to mend relations with Turkey very quickly with the coup attempt. He came out talking against that. But there's, you know, what should we, as journalists, we should be looking for is when he meets with President Erdogan, because it's one thing what the other, you know, civil servants or presidential officers say about their foreign policy. I mean, we might imagine a scene where Erdogan would, you know, openly challenge him. Because
Erdogan's quite a strong character as well. We're almost running out of time. I just wanted, in a minute or so we got left, you know, one way of looking at what Theresa May is doing is she may come to the conclusion that with a very weak and divided opposition, a very big deal in the offing, she needs an electoral mandate, and she should go to the country, and that would give her more MPs, and it would ease, perhaps, and that would ease her problems.
She might do. There will be a lot of speculation over the summer. She has gone on the record and says she doesn't think an early election is necessary. But that won't entirely kill off the speculation, as Gordon Brown discovered in 2007. When you're on a honeymoon, and in her case with a very small majority, certainly over the summer, she has one chance, which would be early November. After that, it becomes impossible in the winter and all the rest of it. So she will have to make a decision. I mean, she might just emphatically rule it out and kill all speculation, but there must be a bit of her. She's quite cautious in spite of that ruthless reshuffle. But even so, there must be a bit of her tempted to say, with all this legislation I've got to get through, to have a majority of 180 beats a majority of 12. So I think it's going to lurk in the background. Not likely, but possible.
And I just wondered if she's cautious until she isn't, and then she is quite bold. I mean, she's been very bold in the past few days.
Yeah, and I've met some of the victims over the last 48 hours, and some of those who've survived the cult, and they all are sort of walking around in a kind of complete shocked daze.
But there are questions about legitimacy that are already being asked, despite the weakness and the crisis amongst the Labour opposition, because we have this Prime Minister with a completely no general election and a completely different top government, and there are questions being asked about that.
Indeed. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. That's it for Dateline London for this week. You can comment on the programme on Twitter @GavinEssler and also engage with our guests. We're back next week at the same time. Please make a date with Dateline London. Goodbye.